The other day, I posted my top 10 quarterbacks of the 2020 college football season, so today we're going to be taking a look at my top 10 running backs from the 2020 season. But before we get to today's video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you never miss another video. If you're a college football fan, then this is definitely the place for you. As always, before I get to my top 10, let's go over a few honorable mentions. Lost in the spotlight behind Zach Wilson was running back Tyler Allgeier. In his sophomore season, he rushed for 1,150 yards, the 8th most in the country. His 13 rushing touchdowns were the 10th most in the country. He also averaged 7.5 yards per carry, one of the highest numbers among players who had at least 150 rushing attempts. Allgeier had a rushing touchdown in every game except for only one, the second game of the season against Troy. He rushed for at least 90 yards in 8 games and averaged at least 8 yards per carry in 6. His best stretch of the season came to close out the year. Over his final 4 games, he rushed for 543 yards while averaging more than 10 yards a carry with 6 rushing touchdowns. With Zach Wilson gone next season, look for Tyler Allgeier to have even better numbers than he had this season. Up next is Cameron Peoples, who was arguably the best running back in the Sun Belt in 2020. You can make the case for another player who I'm going to be mentioning next. Peoples rushed for 1,124 yards, which led the conference and was 10th most in the nation. His 6.7 yards per carry were the most in the Sun Belt, along with his 12 rushing touchdowns. Overall, throughout the season, he was really good, but the reason he is named as an honorable mention is due to his final game of the year against North Texas. He had one of the best games we saw from a running back in recent memory. He rushed for 317 yards, averaging nearly 15 yards a carry, while also adding 5 rushing touchdowns. His numbers from the season are pretty skewed because of that one game, but as I mentioned, it was still an all-around very productive season. You can make the case that CJ Marable was the best running back in the Sun Belt as well. He rushed for just under 900 yards, the second most in the conference. His 12 rushing touchdowns tied him with Peoples for the most in the Sun Belt as well. Though his rushing numbers are some of the lowest that you'll see on this list, his involvement in the passing game is what made him one of the top running backs in the country. On the season, he caught 31 passes for over 200 yards with 7 receiving touchdowns. His 19 touchdowns from scrimmage led the Sun Belt and were the 5th most in the country. He had a receiving touchdown in 6 consecutive games. His 3-game stretch to close out the season was fantastic, as he rushed for 157 yards and 3 touchdowns against Texas State, 132 yards and 2 touchdowns against BYU, and 120 yards with 2 touchdowns against Troy. Up next, we have Larry Roundtree III, who for the last 3 years has been one of the most slept-on running backs in the entire country. He was 4th in the SEC this season with just under 1,000 rushing yards. He was 3rd in the SEC and 7th in the nation with 14 rushing touchdowns, and he was 6th in the nation in total plays from scrimmage. He rushed for at least 120 yards 5 times and had at least 2 rushing touchdowns in 4 games. His best portion of the season was a 2-game stretch in which he rushed for 160 yards with 3 touchdowns against Vanderbilt, and then followed that by rushing for 185 yards with 3 touchdowns against Arkansas. Our final honorable mention goes to Travis Etienne, who had a very disappointing season by his standards. His 914 rushing yards were the least amount he's had over the last 3 seasons and were only the 5th most in the ACC. He did have 14 rushing touchdowns, the 2nd most in the conference, and 7th most in the nation. However, he only averaged 5.4 yards per carry and seemed like he was nowhere to be found in the biggest games of the season. He rushed for only 28 yards against Notre Dame and only 32 yards against Ohio State. But the reason he's able to make his way onto this honorable mentions list was his role in the passing game. He was arguably the best pass-catching back in the nation, as he caught 48 passes for 600 yards with 2 touchdowns in 2020. Alright, well, those were my honorable mentions, so let's get to the top 10. Khalil Herbert comes in at number 10. After an okay career at Kansas, he transferred to Virginia Tech and was fantastic for the Hokies in 2020. He only rushed for 8 touchdowns, but he was one of the best when it came to getting yards. His 1,183 rushing yards were the 2nd most in the ACC and the 5th most in the country. His 7.6 yards per carry were also the 2nd most in the conference and the 8th best in the nation. For good measure, he averaged 26.9 yards per kick return, the highest number in the country. He rushed for at least 100 yards in 6 games. His best game of the season came against Duke when he rushed for over 200 yards with 2 rushing touchdowns. At number 9 is Kyren Williams, one of the best up-and-coming running backs in the country. After only 4 carries in 2019, he upped that number to 211, the most in the ACC and the 4th most in the country. He rushed for 1,125 yards, the 9th most in the nation, while punching in 13 touchdowns, the 10th most in the nation. He was also very efficient in the passing game, as he caught 35 passes for over 300 yards with a touchdown. He rushed for at least 110 yards 6 times and had at least 2 rushing touchdowns in 5 games. He really put his name on the map when Notre Dame took down Clemson back in November. For the game, he had 140 rushing yards with 3 rushing touchdowns. Up next is the first running back from a crazy duo that we saw from North Carolina in 2020, Michael Carter. The amazing thing with North Carolina's running backs was the fact that they had 2 of the best in the country while they split carries. Carter finished the season with 1,245 rushing yards, leading the ACC and the 5th most in the country. His 8 yards per carry also led the ACC. In total, he had 11 touchdowns, the 5th most in the conference. Michael Carter saved his best game of the season for last. In his final game of the year, he rushed for over 300 yards with 2 touchdowns on the road against Miami. Coming in at number 7 is Minnesota running back Mohamed Ibrahim. The junior led the Big Ten with 201 rushing attempts and was first in rushing yards with 1,076. His 15 touchdowns also led the Big Ten and placed him at number 5 in the country. He also averaged all these numbers while playing in only 7 games. Had Minnesota played a normal season, he would have been on pace for 2,000 rushing yards and 30 touchdowns. Now, it's unlikely he would have reached those numbers, but it just goes to show the crazy pace that he was on. He rushed for at least 100 yards in all 7 games that he played, including having a pair of 200-plus yard rushing games. The crazy part is, he only scored a touchdown in 5 games, yet he was 5th in the country. He had 2 games with 4 rushing touchdowns and had a game with 3 rushing touchdowns. South Carolina didn't really have a lot go their way in 2020, but at least they had running back Kevin Harris. The sophomore rushed for 1,138 yards, the 2nd most in the SEC and the 7th most in the country. His 15 rushing touchdowns were also the 2nd most in the SEC and the 5th most in the country. He rushed for at least 100 yards 5 times and had at least 200 yards twice, including an incredible outing against Missouri in which he rushed for 243 yards with 5 rushing touchdowns. Before I get to my top 5, if you could please take a second and give this video a thumbs up, I would greatly appreciate it. It only takes a second to do, and it really helps share this video with more college football fans. Coming in at number 5 is who I guarantee is the most slept on running back on this list. Sincere McCormick was the Conference USA Offensive Player of the Year in 2020 for UTSA. The sophomore ran the ball 249 times, the 3rd most in the country. His 1,467 rushing yards were the 2nd most in the country, and his 1,598 yards from scrimmage were the 4th most. His 11 touchdowns led all of Conference USA. He rushed for at least 120 yards in 7 games, including a 250-yard performance against North Texas with 2 rushing touchdowns. Had Buffalo played a full season, or even 3/4 of a season, Jared Patterson could have set all kinds of NCAA records. The MAC Offensive Player of the Year led the conference with 1,072 rushing yards, a 12-game pace of 2,144 yards. Technically, it was in about 5.5 games that he put up these numbers since he exited the Ball State game with an ankle injury. His 19 rushing touchdowns were the most in the MAC and the 3rd most in the NCAA. Again, he did this while playing in only 6 games. In case you forgot, let me read off the single game numbers from Patterson this year. 137 yards and 2 touchdowns, 73 yards and 2 touchdowns, 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. Just right there, those are some pretty good numbers. But then Patterson went out and had arguably the best game we had ever seen from a running back. Against Kent State, he rushed for 409 yards with 8 rushing touchdowns. The funny part is, he could have had even more yards and touchdowns as well. And against Bowling Green, he rushed for 301 yards with 4 rushing touchdowns. This will always go down as one of the biggest what-if seasons in college football history for me. Buffalo would have played in the MAC title game and a bowl game, given Jared Patterson 14 games to play in. He very well likely could have set the single-season rushing yards record and the rushing touchdown record. Before I get to my top 3, drop a comment down below and share with me who your 3 best running backs from the 2020 college football season were. Coming in at number 3 is the other North Carolina running back from the duo I mentioned earlier, this one being Javonte Williams. The junior was 3rd in the ACC and 6th in the country with 1,140 rushing yards. Again, he did this while splitting carries. He had 19 rushing touchdowns, which were the most in the ACC and tied for the 3rd most in the country. He also had 25 catches for over 300 yards and 3 touchdowns in the receiving game as well. His 22 total touchdowns were the 4th most in the country. While splitting carries, he rushed for at least 100 yards 6 times. Like with Carter earlier, Williams' best game of the season also came against Miami. He rushed for 236 yards while averaging nearly 11 yards a carry while adding 3 rushing touchdowns. He had at least 3 rushing touchdowns in 4 different games. If you were to combine the seasons from Javonte Williams and Michael Carter, the 2 running backs combined for 2,385 yards with 28 rushing touchdowns. That's pretty damn good. Coming in at number 2 on this list is one of the 2 running backs who finished in the top 10 of the Heisman voting in 2020. Breece Hall finished in 6th place after an incredible season for Iowa State. He was named the Big 12's Offensive Player of the Year. He led the country with 279 rush attempts and led the country with just under 1,600 rushing yards. His 21 rushing touchdowns led the conference and were 2nd in the nation. Hall rushed for at least 100 yards in the first 8 games of the season for the Cyclones. He had a rushing touchdown in every game and had at least 2 rushing touchdowns in 8 games. If you watched my Heisman video from the other day, I have Breece Hall in my way too early top 10 of potential players who could win the Heisman Trophy in 2021. Coming in at number 1 though is Alabama running back Naji Naji Harris. Had it not been for Mac Jones and Devontae Smith lighting it up, Harris likely would have received more Heisman consideration. The Doak Walker Award winner gave us an incredible season in 2020. He led the SEC with 1,466 rushing yards, the third most overall in the country. His 26 rushing touchdowns were by far the most in the country, but that was largely due to him playing in more games than other players. He also finished the season with 43 catches for 425 yards and 4 touchdowns. Harris ran for at least 120 yards 6 times and had at least 2 touchdowns in 9 games. Like all great players do, he turned things up to close out the season in the biggest games of the year. Against Florida in the SEC title game, he ran for 178 yards with 2 touchdowns while catching 5 passes for 67 yards and 3 touchdowns. Then, in the playoff semifinal, he rushed for 125 yards and caught 4 passes against Notre Dame. Then, against Ohio State in the national championship, he ran for 80 yards with 2 rushing touchdowns while adding 7 catches for 79 yards and a touchdown in the passing game. Overall, he was the best running back in college football in 2020 on a team that also had the best quarterback in 2020. And I feel like when I get to my top 10 wide receivers of 2020, Alabama might have the best as well. Well, there's my top 10 for the best running backs in college football from 2020. What do you guys think of the list? Was there a player that was too high, or that was too low, or a player that I didn't even include at all? Drop a comment down below and share with me your thoughts. If you haven't done so yet, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications so you don't miss another video. If you enjoy videos like this, then this is definitely the place for you. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.